Many of you have been in the Lutheran Church for quite some time. And as a result, you realize that we are in the middle of preparing the budget for presenting to the congregation at the November meeting for next year's budget. So we've been getting creative about our narrative explanation of the budget and lining it up to our mission and making sure we're moving in a direction that honors God and honors this congregation and helps us get into a season of growth and excitement. And so as I'm reading this gospel message, and it's about taxes and coins, and it's about giving back to God, I was figuring the Holy Spirit would give me a message about our finances as a church, because that would make sense, right? I'm learning again and again and again, our seasons are not the Lord's seasons. So I was struggling for a long time to get any kind of a message out of this text this week that wasn't related to finances, or was it related to finances? I kept going back and forth. And the part of it that kept coming out at me again and again was the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus and trying to trick Jesus. And I thought my message must be about us not trying to trick Jesus. I was going to say, I dare you to try and trick Jesus and see how that goes for you. Anyway, in the middle of the week, it finally hit me. I keep coming back to this part where the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus, because the Pharisees are doing what I've seen happen again and again in our society, especially recently. So during my seminary time, I took an elective course on social media and technology and how to use these for ministry. I was expecting, as you might have expected, the course would be about writing the perfect Facebook post and translating that post to Twitter and making sure that I could put together the perfect TikTok video to point back to both of the posts. And I could find the latest trending topics and start to create a following so that people would be interested in maybe giving our church a chance for a in-person video because of all that they got out of social media. So I was thinking this course will help me a whole lot in putting online ministry together. And as we got into the course, I found that the course was different. This course was all about the advent of social media in our society, and as a result, how our country has become more and more polarized. Maybe more polarized than we've ever been in history. So throughout this course, we broke into small groups to discuss in our Zoom rooms over the internet what does polarization look like and what does it mean for our ministry. So my one gay pastor friend, I'm going to call him Frank, we had a lot to share on this subject. You see, Frank grew up in a very conservative household in the middle of the Midwest. And when Frank came out as a gay man in his conservative family, the polarization of his family became so severe that they even had trouble having Thanksgiving or Christmas together because the conversations that would come out had so much baggage around them. Frank's parents wanted him to get therapy to restore him to his Christian faith after he had come out. But his faith was growing deeper, more deeply than he ever could have imagined. In the process of his coming out, he decided he needed to become a pastor and tell the world who he truly is. You see, his family was trapped in a binary. You can either feel a certain way towards people or be a Christian. Another one of my seminary friends, I'm going to call her Susan, had relatives that were so polarized by the political environment in our country over the last 5 years that they have stopped even gathering for Christmas or Thanksgiving anymore with extended family. They used to have 15 or 20 people at the Thanksgiving table. Apparently, someone mentioned some politics. It turned into a heated debate. Someone had religious views that other people could not agree with, and the family decided they could never be together for the holidays as extended family ever again. So I was reflecting on this and thinking that while this seems to be a new thing in our country and in our world, these binaries that seem to divide us, I think there are ways that they can be overcome. I see the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Jesus in texts like this gospel today dealing with binary situations, and then Jesus breaking through the binary with a whole nother way we could think about it. And I realize these binaries are nothing new. They've been around for all of time. And we can choose to engage in the binaries, or we could choose a different path. Yeah, the Pharisees, you see, they're thinking, what better way to trap Jesus than to talk about the monetary system in the temple and the monetary system of Rome? If Jesus comes off on the side of the monetary system of the tax collectors in Rome, then they could say he's not truly a religious leader. He's a puppet of the empire. On the other hand, if Jesus says that the temple financial system that allowed for the sacrifices and for the offerings to help the Jewish people with their rituals to make up for the sin in their lives, well, then they could call him a religious zealot and have him arrested by Rome for trying to undermine the international economy that makes the Roman Empire work. So Jesus chooses to expose the trap of the binary. Jesus says, show me a coin. Whose picture is on the coin? And they say, well, Caesar's picture is on the coin. So Jesus says, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God's. We started learning about this tactic in this social media class that I was talking about. You see, my friends, Frank and Susan, along with all my other student pastor friends at the seminary, we all learned that binaries are a trap. There are never only two sides to an issue. There's always a continuum. And every person in the conversation has a different part of that continuum to add to the conversation. And when we discover binaries in our social media feeds, we can pick a side and create inflammatory dialogue. We can create these comment threads that are so entertaining to sit back and read that we might pull out popcorn and start reading, wow, how are these people going to try to destroy each other now? Or maybe we could look deeper and try to see what the actual issue is in our society that created this binary text of the dialogue, and maybe we could put out some invitations to provide a solution rather than providing more heat to the binary. So this obviously would take some practice because we as a society are more into the quick hot button topic, having an opinion. And boy, the hot button topics just seem to increase year after year, month after month, week after week. We have these topics like abortion, racism, LGBTQ, discrimination, conservative versus progressive agendas, and all of these could be turned into conversations if we can keep people away from feeling forced to make a decision which side of the binary they fall on. So we started practicing these types of discussions with one another in our small groups. And I tell you, it was hard at first. But what we found, the most binary issues of today would usually have 7 or 8 different perspectives in a 7 or 8 person small group. And once we got back to the big group environment, out of the 30-some people in our class, we found that we would have up to 15 or 20 or even 25 different perspectives that we could come up with on what was supposedly an either-or binary issue. We found that as we gave people the tools and the ability to have opinions without judgment and without pushing them to one side or the other, we could get into rich discussions about ways we might come together to work together for solutions and for social change and for more diversity within our churches and how we might engage our church environments to be better online communities and better in-person communities for lifting up our wide variety of opinions on these supposedly either or binary issues. We found that as we gave people the tools and the ability to have opinions without making judgment and without pushing people to one side or the other, we could get into really rich discussions. So where do we go with this as a church? I think we need to begin learning as a community in small groups outside of Sunday morning. We can learn how to have these conversations in which people's histories, people's opinions, people's religious backgrounds, and people's upbringing can be valued, and we can listen to them while not allowing it to divide or polarize the conversation. So during our 6-week course in the seminary, all of us studying to be pastors, 90% of us studying to be ELCA Lutheran pastors, we discovered that even though the false binaries set up in our society were splitting us apart, we were all a lot more alike in our perspectives than we realized. With certain issues in a binary, we could be split almost 50% on either side. But as we had dialogue and conversation, and as we were intentional to value one another and try to understand each other's perspectives, we found that for the most part, we were not very far apart on the spectrum of our conversation. But we've been so conditioned to jump to the binaries that it was hard to leave our emotions behind, and our small differences would become derailers of the conversation because we would jump all the way to either side. So I want to end this message today with a story that really opened my eyes about the power of dialogue and conversation. And I want to challenge us to work to be open to one another, especially people who maybe are on the other side of a binary in your own family and in your own life. So in this example that was given to us as our class for this social media technology class, there were 2 groups interested in prison reform. Prison reform is a big issue in our country today. So one group was a partnership of several Jewish synagogues in the Brooklyn area of New York City. This group was working hard to build relationships with prisoners, and it was working hard to learn about the conditions in which the prisoners lived, and the stories of how the prisoners got to where they are today. This group was very interested in working on the legal system, working on the training of police and prison guards, and working to create change so the prisoners would have more opportunity for reform and opportunities to get back into the workforce and into lives that are productive back in mainstream society. And then there was a second group that also wanted prison reform. This was a group of prison guards and their families who lived in rural Ohio. These prison guards were into hunting, gun rights, and smaller government, but they were also into prison reform. They wanted better training for police. They wanted better training for prison guards. They wanted to find better ways to attract more prison guards because prison guards were overworked, understaffed, having to put in excessive amounts of overtime, and this was only making the lives of the prisoners more difficult. They wanted to improve conditions for the prisoners as well. They wanted to help prisoners have more education opportunities to be able to be more productive members of society. And they wanted to see where in each prison they could do reforming to bring a better quality of life to those who have been incarcerated at a young age who have a desire to reform. For the sake of dismantling the many binaries in our society today, there was a group that began working with these 2 seeming polar opposite groups to begin creating discussions of what true prison reform might look like. For this study, many of the Jewish synagogue members and the leaders who are interested in helping create this dialogue were flown to rural Ohio to live with the prison guards and their families for 2 weeks. Those who agreed to be part of this experiment found that they were fearful of going into these houses within these communities that were so far different politically than the communities they were used to in their Brooklyn neighborhoods. Over the course of the 2 weeks, the prison guard families and the Jewish families would sit down and create dialogue where they could not jump to conclusions about the other's opinions, but they were asked to engage on the issues all of them cared so much about within prison reform. It was discovered by the end of the 2 weeks that the two groups had very much in common, and parting one another was actually difficult because they had all become best friends because they shared these issues together, even though politically they should have been polar opposites. 6 months later, the Ohio prison guard families were flown into New York City to live in Brooklyn for 2 weeks in the apartments and condominiums of their Jewish counterparts who still wanted prison reform. So this time the tables were flipped. The prison guard families were very nervous to be in Brooklyn, and they had heard horrible stories about the city and how dangerous it is. But as they had their dialogues each night in the synagogues, they discovered that their friendship had only grown stronger in the months where they had been separated. Many of the families had kept communication going with their friendships, and they had shared their progress in their own communities in prison reform and how it was starting to affect change in their day-to-day lives. By the end of the second 2 weeks, both communities had decided that there is great power in having dialogue where you avoid the binaries and you respect the stories and the backgrounds of the people who care so much about the same things you care for, just from a different political perspective than would have been thought of before. So you see, today in the gospel reading, Jesus doesn't fall into the trap of the binary. Instead, he exposes how things are connected. God owns everything, even the coins of Caesar. And Jesus challenges us to live within our society, giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and at the same time to remember that the one who owns it all is God. And we are to give back to God what is God's, which is everything. So I invite us as we move into a season of budgeting as a church and we work to figure out our church future for the next year, let us also consider our year-end giving, our giving for the end of the year, and what it does for us in the perspective of giving to Caesar what is Caesar's and what it reflects on our year and giving to God what is God's. And my challenge to us as a congregation is to begin learning about how we have conversations throughout our community and about things that we are passionate about, and making a difference for the things that God would have us change together. No matter what the binary is, trying to find those open paths to a continuum of dialogue instead of picking one side or the other. Jesus is challenging us to dialogue and to build relationship, and I think we as a church can rise to the challenge. Amen.